A guy's night out, well, actually, day out, drinking and conversation could be any group of pals in a thousand places and times, but that is 1519's Elizabethan England. And this group of Renaissance bros is about to be involved in a mysterious death that's still debated to this day. Christopher Marlowe and his three friends, each with a checkered past, will become center stage in one of history's earliest celebrity crime scandals. Just like today, people have always been fascinated by seeing the rich and famous fall. Maybe watching their world crumble makes us feel better about ourselves. When the rich die, conspiracy theories follow. When Marlowe died, those theories would go all the way to Queen Elizabeth I. Welcome to History is Criminal. I'm your host, Mick Biddick, and with me, as usual, is my beautiful wife, the unapologetic, unqualified Kimberly. So, Kim, are you ready for some 1590 scandal, murder, and royal intrigue?
I live for a good royal mess. As long as there's drama and deception, I'm in. Let's dig into this dirty past again.
If you don't know the name Christopher Marlowe, then you might not have paid attention in your English literature class. So call your high school English teacher and apologize. If you know him, then you can just hold on while I give a little rundown. Christopher Marlowe is maybe the second best known poet and playwright of Elizabethan England, overshadowed by a guy named William Shakespeare. In the 1590s, however, it was Billy Shakes who was taking the backstage to Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe and Shakespeare were born just 2 months apart in 1564. Marlowe to a shoemaker, while Shakespeare's father was a glove maker. This placed both men solidly in the middle class of Elizabethan England. While little is documented about Shakespeare's education, he was most likely educated at King Edward VI School in Stratford upon Avon, which still stands to this day. Due to his father's position in local government, it's reasonable that this is where the young bard would have studied. Then Shakespeare enters what is called the lost years by those who study his life. His late teens and early 20s are mostly pieced together through unsubstantiated folklore and wild guesses. Meanwhile, Marlowe, about 180 miles to the east, was growing up in Canterbury. His life was much more documented. By the age of 14, he was attending King's School in Canterbury on scholarship. Then it was off to Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. His studies made it look like he was heading off to a life as an Anglican clergy, but instead he headed in another direction. A BA in 1587 was followed by study towards a master's degree. Then Cambridge informed young Mr. Marlowe that they were refusing to grant him the master degree that he had earned.
You've got to hand it to Marlowe. Cut out of the got out of the clergy track, snubbed by Cambridge, and then managed to outshine Shakespeare for a while. That's commitment to chaos.
A rumor had started that Marlowe was heading to France to study to become a Roman Catholic priest. Queen Elizabeth had made an edict outlining any English citizen from being ordained in the Catholic Church. So the university felt they needed to distance themselves from the scandal. Now, if you're a Star Wars fan, you know how upset a person can get if they're denied the rank of master. Marlowe didn't grab a lightsaber and slaughter younglings, but he might have turned to the dark side. The university changed their minds after receiving a letter from the Queen's Privy Council. The letter, in part, told Cambridge they needed to rethink their decision due to the fact that Christopher Marlowe had performed some important services for the Queen. Now, this could have been while he was in France. Just what those services were is unknown, but some evidence supports Marlowe might have been a spy. His life after college, other than his writings, is mysterious. Much of it, like Shakespeare's childhood, is based on rumor and legends and speculation. According to many sources, Marlowe was said to be a brawler with a hot temper. At the time, it was also said that Marlowe was a great companion, able to have a roaring good time in the pub. But the pub was not just a place to hang out with your friends, it was also a place to exchange ideas. England was in the throes of the Renaissance and Reformation, which meant exchanging ideas could be dangerous.
The Renaissance, where happy hour could literally get you executed, and where your pint came with a side of political danger.
Mm. It was also a time of brilliant minds across Europe. People were willing to push the edge of acceptable discourse. Among these was the School of Night. The School of Night was a group of free thinkers led by Sir Walter Raleigh and Henry Percy. At the time of dangerous political upheaval based on religion, the members of the school were said to be atheists. It's itself a possible death sentence. Raleigh, best known for his adventures in the New World and his connections to Queen Elizabeth, was the senior member of the School of Night. Percy had a wilder past, if that's possible. While a Protestant, he was a suspected Catholic sympathizer. He would later spend time in the Tower of London for his possible part in the Gunpowder Plot. Okay, flashback to season 1, episode 30. Gunpowder Plot was a plan to blow up King James I, the rest of the royal family, and all of Parliament. Percy was placed in the Tower for his part, which, in place of execution, is already a pretty good deal. But Percy's time in the Tower was a little different. He had a large apartment, servants, spent a fortune on food, drinks, and books, lots of books, which begs the question, why such a good deal? And has led many to believe that he was a spy in service of the king. This was a group which Marlowe was meant to belong to. He had his first hit play about the same time he was receiving his master's degree. Timberlane is about an Asian emperor, Timur, and changed English literature forever. It also made Marlowe an overnight star. He followed that up with Timberlane Part 2. The sequel was just as big a hit. Other major hits followed. He was the darling of English theater. It is known that he influenced Shakespeare and may have even worked with Billy Shakes on King Henry IV. Some even claim he was Shakespeare, a claim we'll look at in a little bit. Still others say that he was a spy in service of Queen Elizabeth.
You know you've made it big when people can't decide if you're Shakespeare or 007.
31st of May, 1593, Marlowe and the three other men showed up at the home 3 miles outside of London in the town of Deptford. The home served as an inn complete with rooms for intellectuals to meet and discuss their theories, politics, and controversies of the day. What we know about what happened that day came from a coroner's inquest the next day. They played an Elizabethan version of backgammon while Marlowe lay on a bed groggy from too much wine. As they party into the day, they started to run up quite a tab. The rest of them decided it was time to settle up for the day's bill. They divided the tab between them, and each expected to pay their fair share. When Marlowe heard his share of the tab, he questioned the math. In rage, he said his share of the bill was not fair. When one of his companions said the bill was correctly divided up, most likely pointing out just how much wine Marlowe had put away, Marlowe pulled a dagger from the sheath he wore on his back. Shocked at this reaction, the men stared as Marlowe lunged forward and struck one of them on the head, opening a wound. The man staggered back. Marlowe leapt forward again, hitting him on the head again, opening a second wound. As Marlowe prepared to lunge once more, the man grabbed his wrist, and in the struggle, the knife was plunged into Marlowe's eye, killing him instantly.
Only Marlowe could turn splitting the check into a Shakespearean tragedy. It's basically history's first case of dying and die over a bar bill, no less. Now that's commitment to being dramatic.
Marlowe was buried just 2 days later at St. Mary's Churchyard in Deptford in an unmarked grave. The killer was granted a pardon 2 weeks later by Elizabeth. The death of one of the most famous playwrights of his day and possible spy was written off as an accident or, at worst, self defense. Now for the conspiracies.
Ooh, let's hear them. Bring on the theatrics.
One, Marlowe was never killed. This theory has made the rounds for some time, but became more popular in the last half of the 20th century. Calvin Hoffman, writer and literary critic, wrote, in The Man Who Was Shakespeare, 1955, that Marlowe survived the wound. Then a body of a recently executed prisoner was substituted for Marlowe. He then snuck out of England and landed in Italy. This was done to prevent him from being tried as a heretic, because Italy during the Reformation was such a bastion of openness and forgiveness. Just ask Galileo. Anyway, once in Italy, he would write Shakespeare's greatest plays, often set in Italy, such as Romeo and Juliet and The Merchant of Venice. Then he would send them back to his patron, Thomas Wilsingham, who would produce them. They hired the actor William Shakespeare to be the face and name of the plays. Evidence for this is at best weak. First, it comes from the long held idea that William Shakespeare's limited education would have prevented him from writing plays in the number and depth that he's credited with, because some people just don't believe in natural genius. Then there is the fact that some of the lines known to be written by Marlowe seem to parallel some written by Shakespeare. It should be noted that writers in Elizabethan England often borrowed from each other. It was also not unusual for writers to collaborate with one another without credit. Also, many of Shakespeare's plays were first performed before Marlowe's death. As far as Marlowe being in Italy, there's no solid evidence that he ever lived there. There is some talk of a English playwright living in Italy at this time, but no one can really connect it to Marlowe. A lack of evidence has not stopped the Marlowe Society, who was the source for this episode, from continuing to support this theory. Like I love to say, never let facts spoil a good theory.
The Marlowe Society, keeping the maybe he was Shakespeare dream alive, one weak clue at a time.
So, if Marlowe was killed, who and why? So, let's look at some of the theories to answer these questions. Marlowe's love life seems to have been an object of speculation for almost 500 years. And of course, sex and murder is always a great story. The sex angle seems to have started almost as quickly as Marlowe was put in the ground. The death and sex trope even has its own subsets. So, Marlowe was killed by a jealous husband. The angry, wrong man approached Marlowe in the street. The accusations flew. Marlowe, known for his temper, was not going to back down. Accusations turned into a brawl, and Marlowe came out the worst, dying from the wounds delivered by a jealous husband. A second story is that it was a rival angered over a mistress and potential insult by Marlowe. Then an even more scandalous story comes from the rumor that Marlowe was a homosexual. In this version of the death, due to a sexual tryst, Marlowe made a pass at the wrong young man, a young man who turned the mistaken proposition into a deadly encounter.
So basically, Marlowe was either killed by a jealous husband, an angry rival, or a bad pickup line. That guy really knew how to make an impression.
He sure did. Now, of course, in Elizabethan England, you probably wouldn't have got stabbed for hitting on the wrong guy, because they were a little more lenient than other times in history when it came to homosexuality. The evidence for these theories is even weaker than that of him faking his death, moving to Italy, and becoming Shakespeare. But that leads us to the next possible reason for his death. Marlowe was killed to silence his heretical views. Though he had studied theology at Cambridge, he was often rumored to be an atheist. It is also said that he was not silent about his views. Now, understand, this was a time when armies clashed and killed thousands, overthrowing governments over the questions of what a single line of scripture meant. So Marlowe, questioning the divinity of Jesus, was sure to piss off the wrong folks. He was set to be called before the Privy Council to answer for his heresy. Days before he was to testify, Thomas Kidd was called before the council. Kidd, a fellow playwright, had shared a room with Marlowe in 1591. When writings described as, quote, drivers of lewd mutinous libel, unquote, started to pop up around London in 1593, authorities decided it was time to start arresting free thinkers. One of the pamphlets was found at a Dutch church. It contained violent rhetoric and allusions to the works of Marlowe. Kidd was arrested and questioned, surely with torture involved. At the same time, his residence was searched and a quote, vile heretical concepts denying the eternal deity of Jesus was found amongst the papers of Thomas Kidd turned up. The authors of the document also implied that Jesus and the apostles were homosexuals. Possession of such documents were a one-way ticket to the executioner. Kidd, while most likely being tortured, claimed those papers were property of one Christopher Marlowe. Kidd would eventually be released in 1594 after Marlowe's death. Interesting that his charges are dropped right after Marlowe's dropped. This didn't necessarily make things better for Kidd, with many believing he was a heretic. It would be nearly impossible for him to find a benefactor, though the Earl of Sussex might have secretly supported him. The speculation is based on the fact that he dedicated his last play to the Countess of Sussex. It did him little good, however, as he died that same year, 1594, at the age of 35. Just weeks before Marlowe died, it was his time to testify before the Privy Council. Heresy was an insanely serious charge in Elizabethan England, calling for the death penalty, and it would be a gruesome death. It started with hanging, but not to the death. This was followed by disemboweling while still alive, and finished with a good old drawing and quartering. The evidence against Marlowe was solid enough for the kangaroo courts of Elizabethan England. The writings attributed to him, his membership in the School of Night, the statements he had made in the past were more than enough needed by the courts that routinely accepted simple rumors as proof of capital crimes. But Marlowe seemed to have walked out of the hearing with almost no punishment at all. He was ordered to remain in the area and report daily to an officer of the council. There seemed to be a desire to recall him later for more testimony. To say he was getting off light would be an underestimate of biblical proportions.
This is why you always stay on the Queen's good side. One minute it's tea and poetry, the next it's intestines on the cobblestone.
With Marlowe walking away from a death sentence with little more than a curfew may have angered some people. Of course, there was also the idea that Marlowe, a suspected spy, could have given the council evidence of others' blasphemy, basically trading his life and freedom for information. Those who were wronged might have gotten their revenge on Marlowe. Related to this second theory is a third that Marlowe was killed by powerful people in the School of Night, perhaps at the order of Sir Walter Raleigh himself. The School of Night, as it was rumored, was a place where intellectuals shared their more radical ideas. It would make sense that things said there should never leave the group. Raleigh, the reported leader of the School of Night, while at the same time trying to court favor with the Queen, these two positions would be in natural conflict. Others said to be in the School of Night, such as the Earl of Essex, would also have great reason to keep their membership and radical views secret. Much of what was discussed in the school would not only be heresy, but also treason. The Queen, as head of the Church of England, would leave very little wiggle room to question the teachings of the Church without calling into question the authority of the Queen. Even whispers about association with those thoughts could lead to a very painful end. England had lived through nearly a century of religious centered violent conflict. It would be Elizabeth's best interest to keep any radical ideas contained. Marlowe was well known to harbor many of these radical views. Logic would dictate that he would know the names of people in the Queen's orbit who shared those views. With this in mind, it would seem reasonable that when Marlowe was called before the council to testify, members of the school would have reason to worry. At this first hearing, it doesn't seem that Marlowe was tortured, which in itself is surprising. But why would members of the school wait until after he had testified to kill him? And if he did give evidence against Raleigh, why did Raleigh outlive Elizabeth? He was beheaded for treason, but not until the reign of King James I, after supporting a plot to remove James from the throne.
Sounds less like a royal court and more like the world's most dangerous game of Clue. Everyone's guilty. It's just a matter of what of and when.
Great deal rests on the three men who were with Marlowe the night he died: Ingram Fraser, Robert Poley, and Nicholas Seekers were shady figures. All had ties to Francis Wilsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster. Fraser was also said to be a con man who excelled at money-lending schemes. He worked for Marlowe's benefactor, Thomas Walsingham, Francis's brother. It was he who had actually stabbed Marlowe. Polly and Secrets were spies in the employ of Francis. Polly had taken part in the babbling plot to remove Elizabeth from the throne and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. It's likely he was actually an inside informant and reported the plot to Francis. He did spend 2 years in the Tower of London, a very light sentence for high treason. And as noted earlier, not all accommodations in the Tower were all that bad. It's very possible his time in the Tower was a way to keep his cover following the plot. If Marlowe was also a spy, as suggested, in the employ of Francis, then this was a sketchy group of people. This brings us to the theory posed by Russell Ioto of the Crime Library. Marlowe was silenced by his benefactor, Thomas Walsingham. It might be hard to believe that the man benefiting from Marlowe's success as a playwright would have him killed, but he might have had information that Thomas didn't want the Privy Council to have. First, Thomas Walsingham is rumored to have been involved in the School of Night. The members were starting to catch the interest of the authorities. While Thomas had important connections in the royal court, that was no guarantee of protection in Elizabethan England. Even a hint of scandal could lead to a loss of standing, or far worse. Elizabeth, much like her father Henry VIII, was no stranger to signing death warrants, even for minor missteps and family members. If Marlowe were brought back to testify before the Privy Council a second time, it's likely he would have been tortured as they did Kidd, and there would be little reason to believe that Marlowe's loyalty to his benefactor would have held up faced with items such as the pear of anguish, thumbscrews, or the breaking wheel.
Basically, if he'd come back for round two, it wouldn't be a friendly chat. It would be a medieval game show called Guess How You'll Die Today.
If Christopher Marlowe had dirt on Thomas Walsingham, it's clear Walsingham would have good reason to kill Marlowe. It also would have been very easy for Walsingham to lure Marlowe to the home in Deptford. After all, Walsingham was Marlowe's cash cow. With all three men present at the time of Marlowe's death, who were the only eyewitnesses, being financially dependent on the Walsingham family, the script writes itself. If you're keeping track, Walsingham had motive, means, and opportunity. In a court, this would be circumstantial evidence, but people have been convicted with less. So, we can believe that the most famous playwright of his day, Shakespeare, would only eclipse him later, died in a fight over what today would be less than $100, or we can scramble down the rabbit hole chasing scandals and 430 years of rumors. Not only is the latter more fun, but it seems to be human nature. We don't want to accept the idea that famous people we respect, could be killed in a relatively simple or mundane manner. We look for conspiracies because those conspiracies make their deaths more grandiose, more meaningful. A great person killed by a lone nutcase or an accident just doesn't feel right. A great person must die in a manner fitting their greatness. So we tug at the strings and connect the dots, even if they're not there to connect. Our heroes deserve a heroic death. This has been History is Criminal. Come back next week as Kim and I dig into a 1906 murder in the beautiful tourist destination of upstate New York, Adirondacks. Until then, if you like what you heard, tell a friend and leave a review. And if you didn't like it, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.